you very much, and sorry about this slight delay. So I'm Julian Barbière, Head of Marine Policy, and I'm going to continue the presentation in a way that Vladimir initiated on the decade, with a little bit more of a focus on how we create this partnership, and particularly in the context of data and data supporting sustainable development policies of our member states. So I'm going to start with slides that I think Vladimir finished with, which describes very much the importance of delivering a number of scientific breakthroughs, which of course is a key endeavor of this decade. But I think I just want to highlight here the transformative nature of what we are trying to do here for this decade, because transformation is really required in the way society recognizes and reuses scientific information, whether it's in terms of informing citizens about the health of the ocean, to inform business operations and operators that are active in the marine environment, or in supporting decision makers. It's also transformative in the way technologies can be used to understand the human impacts on the Earth systems, and the way we are developing this science policy dialogue at various levels. And of course, throughout that process, the importance of data and information is really the nerve of all of our activities here, and a key element in the work of a decade. And in a way, what we are trying to do in this framework is to support the scientific enterprise in terms of delivering science to policy. And to do that, the decade is really about establishing a dialogue between the scientists and the policymakers. We have, of course, the Agenda 2030, which has been, which is a major framework, and the decade is really, the difference is not just science for science, but science for sustainable development. So it's really about establishing a strong research collaborations. It's about synthesizing existing research. It's about co-designing research strategies with the inputs of stakeholders and decision makers. It's about conducting this research and cooperation across various basins. It's about synthesizing and assessing results and developing data products, for example, that can really inform and bridge science and policy. And of course, all of this will require funding, partnerships. It will require the engagement of stakeholders. It requires the integration of natural and social sciences. And as mentioned by Vladimir, capacity development is also a core requirement to ensure that nobody is left behind when we implement this decade. And again, data and information is really at the core of this enterprise. And I think will be a key element of the work ahead of us. Now, if we look at the different research and development priority areas that have been described, and Vladimir already alluded to some of them, the mapping of a digital atlas, the ecosystem knowledge, particularly focusing on understanding of cumulative stressors, and so on. All of these have, in a way, a strong data and information component in itself. But I think we also have identified data and information as a potential flagship initiative under the decade, where we could really develop a strong partnership in order to deliver this, particularly this outcome, which has been mentioned, of transparent and accessible ocean. And we have a roadmap which was presented to the IOC Executive Council last year. And in there, it already identifies some potential activities under each of those research and development areas. But of course, those are not finalized, and they require enrichment by various communities. And this is why we are also developing this preparation phase to really engage and receive these contributions from various communities in terms of defining what are their needs, what are the type of science we want to develop, and for what purposes. So in this roadmap document, there is a description particularly that it identifies the need for a dedicated information and data portal, which would really provide a core mechanism for organizing and disseminating data and information produced across the decade portfolio of activities. And in there, you can already see a number of principles that have been identified. We want this to be very much an open access mechanism. We want this data and information portal to support the advancements across scientific disciplines. The importance of integrating social science and human dimensions, as I mentioned earlier. The very direct contributions to sustainable development applications, whether we are talking about delivering and providing information that can support a blue economy or informing the status of ocean health. It also mentions the role of private sector that could be a beneficiary and contributors. So here we need to start thinking about what kind of partnerships we want to put in place to deliver and engage with the private sector. We also need to look at how new technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, but over big data applications, can be applied and translated into deliverables in this context. We need to address the issue of equitable access and benefits for developing nations. This is, again, a very important when we look that we see that many countries are lacking the basic facilities for just accessing internet, for example. And of course, this requires developing standards and interoperability of data and information products. And all of this needs to be looked at in the context of the impact that we are trying to deliver, whether it's in terms of helping to solve scientific questions and addressing societal needs, or to contribute to the improvement of management of marine resources. We also need to look at the feasibility aspect. We need this information and data provided that needs to be scientifically credible. We need this to be technically practical, cost-effective, and of course enduring. And then we need to think about the legacy. This is a very important question that we need to start addressing now, not at the end of a decade. If you look at initiatives such as the Census of Marine Life, which left us this great present, which is the Ocean Biogeographic Information System, this is a core program which needs to be tailored and supporting the policy needs. So we need to think about some of these issues in the design stage and not just in the implementation or at the end. And then we need to think about data for what? Scientific data that we anticipate to be generated by the decade is needed to inform the policy process, the business operations, the interests of civil society. And it's really trying to see how we can package this in different clusters, from understanding the global and more localized drivers of the state of the marine environment, but also understanding the status of ecosystems, whether we're talking about marine biodiversity or the societal benefits that are being derived from the marine environment. And then it's also about delivering on solutions that may, for example, include the identifications of scenarios that can be supported by innovative ocean prediction models. And of course, all of this information and data are required at different scales because many of those problems have a different spatial dimension. Some of those are more focused on the global aspects, and we need to understand how those are interlinked at different scales as well. So if we talk about supporting the integrated management of the ocean, I guess we can then say that we probably need integrated data to do this. And we need to develop a number of additional attributes so that the data and information can be used to help us and can be better integrated. And we can think about how to share this data in a more easily and user-friendly way. We need to improve the traceability of the data. We need to develop interoperability of spatial data sets and services. We want this to be multi-stakeholder focused, so different type of users will derive the different services and will access different products. We want this to be in a networked environment where you will be able to discover across fields, you'll be able to view and download the information and the data. For that, we need, of course, data and service sharing, and we need to define the protocols for doing this. We also need stakeholders to be able to customize the information and the data they are deriving. And of course, we have many challenges. We can try, and I guess you know this more than me. You are the data people. I'm just a policy guy talking about data. But we have, of course, the issue of diversity of data and sources and formats that in the majority of cases makes it very difficult to create intercomparison between different data sets. So we need to go from this challenge and really try to move into a more user-friendly environment where we have data which is interoperable and where data users can derive different type of products depending on the needs. So let me step back a little bit now from the data aspect. Well, still a little bit on the data really, but and look at how can we use the decade, and in particularly the Agenda 2030, to try to harness and develop a partnership specifically focusing on ocean data. We have the SDGs, we have SDG 14, and we have a number of international organizations which are collecting data on the implementation of the SDGs, looking at various dimensions, whether those are focusing on stress indicators of marine pollution, of overexploitation of fisheries, looking at the status of habitats. For example, we have UNEP, which is documenting different type of marine and coastal ecosystems, mangroves, coral reefs. We have the FAO, who's keeping count on stock assessments and developing regional database, which really create information about the status of fisheries. So there is, and this is just the international organizations. Of course, these data are very much also shared and owned at different other levels. But I think there is a real potential to use the decade and the SDG to try to come up with a global discussion on how we can harmonize and make this data far more interoperable and far more powerful in the way we are helping to describe the connections, the interconnectivity of our marine environment. For example, looking at the impacts of climate change on fisheries. I mean, we have a lot of data on the state of the ocean, on physical aspects, on ocean acidification. How are we combining this with the status of fisheries stocks and aquaculture at the coastal level? Those are, I think, questions we need to address. Now, I mentioned that the data is very much dispersed around, and it's sitting in various types of organizations, whether it's governmental agencies, the private sector, academia, research infrastructures, and I mentioned, of course, the international organizations. And in a way, we already have maybe a first step in the right direction, and that's IODE. And IODE, Vladimir mentioned that earlier, and we will, I guess, in the course of this week, hear a lot about IODE and its ambition. But I think it's maybe a basis, a foundation for developing this kind of mapping of where the data sits. Now, of course, so far, I think we're talking about different type of organizations who are contributing to all this, but we need to expand that to other organizations, and I think we need a strategy to do that. Also want to mention big data, because, I mean, clearly everybody is talking about big data, so we need to start to think how we can use this untapped potential in the context of marine environment. Some estimate that 90% of the data in the world has been created in the last 2 years, and it's projected to increase by 40% annually. So in a way, big data can really complement official statistics and other type of data by adding depth and nuance to information on human behaviors and experiences. we have new sources of data, we have new technologies, and if applied in a responsible way, we could enable more agile and efficient evidence-based decision-making that can better measure progress. We, of course, need to be very conscious about the risks and the challenges, the issue of privacy, of ethics, or data sovereignty, as well as the growing inequality and bias in the use of big data. So again, this is something, I'm not giving you an answer here, I'm just raising the question, and I think a lot of those big data also implies some level of partnerships with the private sector. So we need to think about the kind of partnership model we want to put in place with the private sector to operationalize this concept. There's a concept of data philanthropy, for example. Is this something that we could try to promote in the context of a decade? Those are questions that I think we can think about in the course of this week. Now let me step back and, we talked about data, I talked about different stakeholders who have an interest in data, both in terms of contributors and users. I want to give you a bit of an overview of how we're trying to engage at the whole level of a decade. And of course, the first step is really to try to identify who we need to engage. And we have identified a number of groups of stakeholders that we want to be involved. And of course, we're talking about the ocean science and technology community. And clearly, we need to start with this group, because those can formulate priorities, advances, and align the agenda for global ocean science. We want the ocean policy and sustainable development, who can help and drive the development of solutions to ocean sustainability challenges. And in there, of course, we have different levels. We have national level, we have the regional and organizations, we have the UN bodies who have the responsibility for managing specific ocean sectors. We want the business and industry involved because they can access tools and information required to find solutions. They can invest in the blue economy and invest in research and development. We want donors and foundations because we need, of course, to create partnerships, and we need to align and leverage the investment that those organizations are putting into ocean research. So those are some of the examples of stakeholders that we have identified. And of course, we've started a mapping process to really trying to understand at a much more granular scale what type of organizations are contained within these big categories. And the idea is to try to also see which ones are the most relevant to engage with, because it's difficult to start with everybody. So we need to be strategic, and we need to look at the more influential ones and the ones who can leverage their own networks and communities in the work of a decade. And in doing this, we of course need to understand what are the motivations of stakeholders to engage, because they are very much different. Some organizations are focusing on advancing knowledge. Some other ones want to create new collaborations. They want to translate research into policy. Others want to have an economic growth and commercial opportunities, and so on. And then their contribution is also may differ from people, from expertise, from technology development, from the provision of research infrastructures. And I need to hurry up. So to understand this interest and these potential contributions, we've put in place a pretty exhaustive process for consultation in this preparatory phase. We have 2 years. By 2020, we need to deliver an implementation plan for the decade, and which will be considered by the UN General Assembly. And this plan needs to be pretty detailed in terms of defining the objectives, defining the different decade portfolio and programs. It should have a capacity development plan. It should have a monitoring and reporting component, because clearly this is a plan that will be updated in the course of a decade. We're not going for a static plan and 2020 and then we revisit in 2030 and see what happened. This is something that will need to be built. So we will need to have every 2 to 3 years a review of this plan. And to get to that plan, we have established an executive planning group, and there is at least a couple of members who are here with us in the room. This is a group of 20 experts, and which is acting as an advisory body to the IOC Secretariat. And we had our first meeting in December, so we are advancing now with in getting guidance from this group. We have also a number of global and regional workshops to try to flesh out these different research and development areas that I mentioned earlier, and to do this through stakeholder engagement in discussions, and as well as a stakeholder forum where we can have institutional interest being represented and providing feedback in the development of the implementation plan. And of course, we need the other UN bodies involved in this work. UN Oceans is identified as a key player in facilitating also the implementation of a decade in the other fora, UN fora. And of course, this is something that we started to do. So we have a pretty busy timeline, as you may expect, between now and 2020. We have a number of global meetings, and the first global planning meeting, which will happen in May this year. And then this will be followed by a number of regional workshops to really try to understand what are the needs at the regional level, what are the priority areas, what are the existing building blocks that we can build on, but also to try to identify what kind of data products, for example, our communities want. So I'm getting there. So this is just an overview of what those different workshops are supposed to achieve. And of course, the first global planning meeting I mentioned will take place in Copenhagen, so you can write down this date, because we also anticipate and would like to see many of the IODE communities represented at this meeting. And of course, we need to do this in partnership. I just want to highlight that IOC cannot do it all by itself, and it's very important that we join hands with other regional organizations, both in the organization of these regional workshops, but also in having them identify their own contributions. Just want to highlight that, for example, for the Westpac and Pisces region, we have defined that we will have a regional workshop at the end of July here in Tokyo, and this has been facilitated thanks to the support of the Japanese government. So I'm getting there. This is my last slide. Oops, no. Well, there we go. Or maybe just can I say a few words there? Okay. So I think this is a very ambitious work that we have ahead of us, and of course our challenge will be to meet the growing range of societal demands to achieve SDG 14, and this can only be done by realizing all the elements of the ocean value chain and ensuring that those are resourced adequately and more integrated science agendas are advanced. And to do this, of course, we need global capacity building and resource sharing between countries. We need to deliver data and information to support the integrated research, governmental actions, the work of the private sector and the public interest. We need to build on new technologies to improve ocean observations, and we need to make use of a digital revolution to transform ocean science and the delivery of information to where it is most needed. Thank you very much.